I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about opening possibilities so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you have options from which to choose. Well, today, my guest is Uma Lele. Excuse me. Uma has been one of the most interesting and impactful persons that I've ever known, influencing the lives of millions of people. So stay tuned to find out how. Okay, let's talk about Uma Lele so you get to know why I am so excited about this conversation. She's the first woman to be awarded the PhD in Applied Economics by Cornell University at the age of 24. She has decades of experience in research, operations, policy analysis, and evaluation. A significant part of her experience was acquired in developing regions from a base at the World Bank, as well as in U.S. universities and other international organizations. Currently, she is affiliated with the Institute of Economic Growth, University of Delhi in India. In 2018, she was elected the president-elect of the International Association of Agricultural Economists. And on August 31st, 2021, she became its president, the first woman to be elected to this position in their 92-year history. She was responsible for planning the first all-virtual 31st International Conference of Agricultural Economists held during August 17 and 31 in 2021. She has contributed well over 130 book chapters, papers, articles, and other writings on food and agriculture, the environment, public health, science and technology, aid and finance, and evaluation in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Her honors and awards are numerous, 10 at last count from more than 4 countries. I'm going to leave it at that. She has established 3 mentorship programs at the Agricultural and Applied Economic Association for students from developing countries, and an award for Best Researcher on Gender at the International Association of Agricultural Economists. There, she is actively promoting women in the agricultural economics profession and expanding opportunities for their professional advancement. Uma is also my friend of more than 35 years, and she is one of my heroes. Mainly because in the midst of the many accolades she has received and the work she has done, she always acknowledges those who helped her, whether it was contributing to the end product or however. Okay, it's time for you to meet Uma Lele. Uma, welcome to Unlocked.
Thank you. That's a long introduction. I was impressed. I thought, who is this person?
Oh, well, I debated whether I should make it a little shorter, and I said, no, people have got to know. Well, Uma, I want to begin by asking you a question that a teenager asked. See, I always ask teens to, look at what I'm going to be talking about and say, what are you interested in? What kind of questions would you like to ask? And this is one of theirs. And believe it or not, it was my first question. Define agricultural economist for us. What does it mean to you? And how are you impacting the world specifically?
That's a good question. I hadn't really thought about it until you asked me that question. So anyway, agricultural economics is the economics of agriculture. In a way, that's obvious. And I think it kind of evolved as a very major branch of economics in the early 1900s. And then my hero professor, Ted Schultz, who was a professor of economics at University of Chicago and won a Nobel Prize, elaborated on it much further. So, the idea in agricultural economics is to address issues of resource allocation within agriculture.
Mm.
But what Ted Schultz did was to, uh, he had a very important insight. He said that small farmers are rational. We all think that, they have very low level of productivity, etc. But they're doing things rationally from their point of view, and we must understand why they are doing what they are doing, etc. So it piqued my interest in economics partly because of the kind of a professor he was. And then my other professor, John Miller, wrote a book on the role of agriculture in economic development, which was very relevant for my background because most developing countries have a large amount of population in agriculture, and the productivity in the agricultural sector is very low. So the development challenge for economists is to move this population out of agriculture into the rest of the economy, hopefully into higher productivity activities, which is called structural transformation from agriculture to non agriculture or industry. And most of my work in the last 30, 40 years has been related to these activities. So that's what agricultural economics is.
Ah, thank you so much for that. I think sometimes today we become so enamored with the fact that technology seems to drive the economy, and yet not very long ago, in terms of years, maybe 100 years, agriculture was extremely important to the economy. Am I right?
Yes, but even now, I'm glad you raised the issue of technology because the Green Revolution in Asia was a result of technological change, where new varieties were brought to countries that had very low levels of productivity, and they were highly susceptible to droughts and food shortages, etc., etc. So dramatic changes occurred in India, for instance, in the 1960s and 70s as a result of Norman Borlaug bringing new wheat varieties to India. And that's a technological revolution. That's what ag economists usually talk about as the dramatic change in agriculture.
Mm.
So technology is very important, and it continues to be important now because digitalization has increased, and it's also increased access to very poor farmers who normally don't have access to many other things, but they have an access to a cell phone,
Yeah.
so they can look at their cell phone and they can learn a lot about agriculture from digitalization. So technology is fundamental.
Fundamental. Excellent. Thank you. Well, you say that you have learned many, many lessons in your life, and as I have researched and read some of your presentations, I I know that there are things that happened in your life that are really important to getting you to where you are today. And I wonder if you would just begin to talk about that. What was it, and how did you learn some of these lessons?
Um, you know, I often get asked this question because at least maybe 10 years ago, there used to be this image of Indian women as being very backward, and the persecution and violence about Indian women, etc. So many people would ask me, how come you became an economist and you worked at the World Bank? What explains your story? And I hadn't really reflected on it, but as I began to get asked these questions again and again, as I started thinking, and my first natural reaction was it was my father who played a very important role in my life. And I didn't know at the time that it was so important because I was a kind of a typical goofy teenager who did not pay much attention to studies. I like to see Bollywood movies. I used to skip classes and see movies which he didn't know. But he always had a big ambition for me. And that I wish now he was alive and I could ask him why that was the case, because in those days, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, nobody paid that attention to women's education, etc. But in my case, he did. So he was very particular that I should do well in school, in college. I participated in all the debating contests, and I had to run for the president of student association, which I didn't care about. But my mother would say to me that at dinner, your father is going to ask whether you have entered your name for the competition, and if not, he'll be very upset. So I would do all these things because of him. And then when it was time for me to get married, and some young man who I later married came to ask my father if he could marry me. Um, my father said, no, she's too young. I was only 18 years old at that time. And we don't want her to get married without getting more education. So why do you want to marry her? And he said, because I'm going abroad to Cornell to do a PhD. And then my father thought about it for a while and said, if she also could go to with you and do a PhD, not just be a housewife, then maybe we can think about your marriage. That was a very high bar because I just finished my BA.
Wow.
And so I applied like crazy to American universities. And I got into many of them, and University of Chicago gave me a fellowship. And I could come to Chicago and then later on to Cornell to join my husband. And that really dramatically changed my life, because otherwise I would have been just a boring housewife in India, I think. With
I, I love the fact that he really pushed you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, when I think about children, child rearing, etc., I realize that people like me who have very ordinary accomplishments, not great intelligence, etc., but opportunities can make a big difference, and ambition makes a difference. And I didn't have that ambition when I was young, but he had it for me, and that really made a big difference. So everything I have done since then, I mean, my getting a PhD, working at the World Bank, being exposed to people of many different accomplishments, they constantly stimulate me. Being in their company is a great privilege, and none of that would have happened if my father had said, she can't go abroad without doing a PhD.
Well, I remember from one of your presentations, you said there was a big lesson that you learned from that. Uh,
Yeah.
would, would you,
I think that's interesting. I agree what I said there, that enlightened, progressive parents well ahead of their time can make a big difference. And I don't know how relevant it is in today's time, but because young people have more influence from social media than they do from their parents. They don't spend as much time with their parents as we used to, but parents can make a very big difference.
mm,
Yeah.
indeed. Um, you know, again, going back to the questions posed by the teenagers, this is one that I just loved. What's the most wonderful or beautiful thing you've experienced through your years?
Oh my goodness, that's a very hard question to answer in a way, because I've been very blessed to have so many wonderful moments in my life,
Mm,
right? So the first was obviously finishing a PhD and not having my parents bug me about my my PhD. But then my mother was behind and always writing a letter to say, you still don't have a child. And I was only 20, I was only 23 years old. And so I had to, then I I had my son when I just finished my PhD, my oral exams, and it was a boy, and it makes a big difference in India, as you probably know, the in the Indian culture to have a boy rather than a girl. Although I was hoping for a girl, and so I wrote to them with great excitement. In those days, there were no cell phones or internet or anything, so it used to be letters and once in a while a phone call. And I wrote to them to say they should be happy that I now not only have a PhD now, but I have a little boy that I'm going to raise. And I think they said that's the best present you could have ever received. And I said, we'll wait and see. And
Well,
it's turned out to be a very good present. I'm very lucky that I have a very good son. He's accomplished a lot, and I've used a very different method of raising him than my parents. I didn't press him on anything, but he says just by being around you, I had to make sure that I was always fulfilling your expectations and not disappointing you. So, and then all this travel all over the world, working with people of many accomplishments, and learning from them a lot, that's been a real blessing for me.
mm, it reminds me so much of when I was growing up. My grandfather was the great one for education. So
Mhm.
that even in those days, which would have been around, gosh, the turn of the 20th century, um, he he really pushed his children to get
Yeah,
educated, and everyone thought he was a fool, but in fact he was not, because there
yeah,
are many PhDs in my family, and well, I can go on and on in terms of what was accomplished. Yeah, yeah, it's amazing those early things, that how they influence. And I also love the fact that you say that you were challenged to aim high.
yeah. Aim high because, when I look back on my childhood and I ask myself, could I have ever thought about doing all the things that I'm doing? And it's mainly because throughout my life from childhood, my parents really had big ambitions for me. Whatever it is that I was doing, do the best you can. And that helped a lot, including cooking by my mother, who wrote 6 books on cooking.
Really?
Yeah, after we left, she was so bored. So she said to my father, I don't know what I should do because the kids are all gone. And he said, cook and write books. And she did.
You did.
So, so she's been a great role model for cooking.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Another thought occurred to me. Oftentimes, when I work with young people, we talk about the kinds of friends that they have,
Yeah.
and they think about what that friend can know, what that friend is, and does that reality elevate them, or
Yeah.
does it pull them down? And so I loved your story about the fact that just your son just being with you and your accomplishments elevated him to things that he might not have thought of.
Yeah, I was surprised. I think one day he took a paper that I had published in Science magazine to his teacher, um, and the teacher was very impressed because Science is a reputed journal, and it was quite casually that that paper got published in Science. So he came back very impressed that his teacher was very impressed that his mother had published something. So I didn't have to say anything to him.
Yeah,
He,
yeah, yeah,
he just had to, I mean, he learned so much by osmosis in
yeah.
a way.
That's right. Well, now we've talked about all the wonderful support that you got. So what happened when you hit the ground with as a professional? What were some of those experiences? Because I recall the World Bank can be a pretty tough place, having been there
That was
myself.
a pretty tough place. That was a pretty tough place. And I think most of my life, professional life, uh, I was in places where I was expected to perform in contexts where I wasn't really prepared for it. So when I first started my job at the World Bank, um, some finance minister in Africa had asked the bank to do a study on rural development. And there was nobody around to do this study, so they asked me to do it. And that is not the reason why they had hired me in the first place. So they had hired me to work on Asia. And in those days, with lack of internet, lack of information on countries, I was absolutely in the middle of deep sea on knowledge of Africa. And I had to learn everything by myself.
Mm,
And then I think the usual stereotypes about women in those days, there were very few women in the World Bank. And there certainly were very few black and brown women in the
yes,
bank in those days.
yes.
So when people came to know that this young woman of 30 years old is being asked to do a big study on Africa, they would take one look at me and say, good luck. So it was very hard, but I think I realized again in retrospect that if the expectations are low, then you can always exceed them.
Yes.
So you should not feel badly that people don't expect anything from you because you can surprise them. And I think that was truly the experience I had on working on Africa. Expectations from me were very low, and I had to struggle, work very hard to learn everything about Africa. And one of the ways I did this was to do case studies. You may ask me a question about it. My approach to doing research evolved over time from data analysis to case studies
Mm,
because I was raised by doing a PhD with lots of analysis of data on India, but there was no data on Africa.
mm,
So the only way we could learn something about Africa was going there, learning something about the details of everything. How was tobacco grown and how was tea grown and coffee grown and what happened to small farmers, etc., etc. So it's that which led to all those case studies on different projects in Africa, which was something I had never done, and I had some very good colleagues who did these case studies. So I learned a lot from it, but it also changed expectations about me. And then the reverse happened because in the beginning I was kind of looked at as, a know nothing woman who doesn't know what she's doing and being asked to do a study on Africa. And suddenly that book became so famous in those days
mhm.
that then some people, particularly men, I should say, used to refer to me as a prima donna. I, I didn't even know what that meant, but they would write evaluations about me that although she is a prima donna, she's managed to adjust to the humdrum life in the World Bank.
I, I think that is just so amazing. Now, I mean, because I know you, you are anything but a prima donna.
Yeah, and I didn't even know what that meant.
Yeah.
But I think it's the perception, how it, perceptions change about you. And in my case, there were dramatic changes in perceptions from a know nothing little brown woman in India, from India working on Africa, to suddenly a prima donna. And none of those things are real. So you have to adjust your behavior to what you are
Mm.
essentially,
You
and
said
not
something.
like
You
Not
said
let those descriptions affect what people think about you.
that is so important that you just said that the words that are used, the descriptions that are used, are simply not right. And if you acquire them and you accept them, it just it is disruptive to you. Whereas
Yeah.
you're really looking at the reality of who you are. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
and
So I think it was the third lesson of my life, as you say, life is hell when your colleagues think so little of you, which was the case
yeah.
in my case. But it changed over time.
Mm,
But it also challenges you to say, well, you're going to show to them that you are not what they think you are.
thank you. Yeah.
Either a know nothing person or a prima donna, neither of those things. Just a normal human being.
Well, I, I find it challenging to think of you as normal. although, although certainly in just about every interaction I've ever had with you, you've been uh, extraordinary simply because you were so present to every moment that you're talking with someone or being with them. So that's even that is extraordinary. Well, you mentioned case studies, and our topic today is deep case studies in the life that counts. Uh, I wonder if talk about those. What tell us a little bit more about a case study and what does it mean to do a deep case study?
Um, it's funny, I have done case studies all my life, but I wonder whether, unlike Harvard University, whether I developed a methodology for case study. My first reaction to the case study approach is um, to have an open mind
Mm,
and learn as much as you can about the details of what's going on in that case.
yeah.
And that makes a big difference to what insights you develop and what you learn from it. So, having an open mind, getting new information and new data, and then developing your understanding of that situation. And
Now,
what you bring to bear in a case study is your perception of that situation, not somebody else's.
mm,
And it's not just objective data, but your own perspective on what you're seeing. And it's often that perspective that contributes a lot to the understanding. So I would encourage people to have an open mind, learn a lot, and don't be afraid to reflect your point of view after what you have learned from it. That's the most important contribution a case study can do.
now, when you did did case studies, is it that you because in Africa there was no data? Did you go on field trips? Did you talk to people? Did you interview them? How did you gather what insights you gained?
Yeah, I did a lot of field work in those days. And I still remember when I look back, my son was very little. He was only 6 years old when I joined the bank. And at that time, I was a single mother, and it was very difficult uh, to. I was told, don't ever tell your boss that you can't go anywhere because you have a small son. So
Yeah.
I was never. I mean, times have changed a lot. I was never supposed to talk about my family life or my son or my challenge or anything. So I did travel a lot. I used to travel about 90 days a year,
Mm,
going to different places in Africa where I had never been before. So I went to so many countries in Africa in those days. And I had good colleagues who were also doing case studies, by the way, of
mm.
different projects. So we learned a lot. And in fact, I used to go to Tanzania so often that they, instead of calling me Uma Lele, they used to call me Mama Lele.
Oh, that's marvelous.
That goes to show you how much I visited Africa, and in Tanzania, I used to go there so often. But I learned a lot from those visits.
I also very much appreciate that you say that part of the way in which you did case studies, and people, I hear it as a recommendation as well, that your your interpretation, your assessment is part of it, and it's an important part of it. Uh, so often we think that it has to be only the perfectly logical pieces that go together. What I'm hearing you say is that sometimes, yes, it's logical, but not necessarily visible because it comes out as your opinion. Wonder if you'd comment on that.
You know, the situation in Africa was very different in those days than it was in India, because there was substantial amount of human capital in India, and much more developed institutions compared to Africa. So this phenomenon that I noticed in looking at projects in Africa is that most of them were designed by foreigners, by ex-colonialists who had left Africa and come to work for the World Bank, etc. And that was very different than in India. Even in the beginning, everything that the bank was um, approving in India was designed by Indians, and similarly in China, by the way. So I think the big difference was that Indians were bargaining hard for the conditionality or whatever, something they could deliver, they could not deliver, but it was based on their own ideas of what was deliverable.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Africa, that was not the case. So many of the projects were designed without much appreciation of what the countries could do themselves. And I think that was a very new insight for me, having had one advantage of not knowing much about Africa and starting to work there was this insight that local participation was very, very important. And I think that was one of the big findings of my study. And in those days, local participation was a new idea in development economics. So the book became very popular among students, especially graduate students, where it was recommended as a required reading in many universities. And its big message was participation. So those insights came from my own observations of what I was seeing in Africa compared to India, which was just a background for where I was. I had seen things.
But I think that's a really important point that because you had multiple perspectives in because of your experience, that added to your ability to assess what was happening on the ground in Africa.
Yeah, but I think when I look back on what were some of the marvels of the working at the World Bank, for instance, we had people from all over the world working in the bank, and they brought very different experiences to bear. So it was not just my own experience, but the experiences of the Brits and the French and Africans, etc. And the more you work with them and develop insights from their experience of what they are seeing, then that adds value to what the bank is doing. So, in a way, the bank as an international institution is a marvelous institution, although there are a lot of things that one can criticize it for. One of those is that this international character of the staff that bring a lot to bear to the work of the bank.
I could not agree with you more. I think I spent 10 years there in the bank, and I have always looked for opportunities to bring multiple perspectives onto
Mhm.
any team that I form because it's more interesting, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I think it's funny. I have all kinds of questions that I was going to ask you, and you're just obviously just moving along and answering them before I even ask them. Um, let's see. Okay. Obviously, you have done many different things, and you've, at one point, obviously, you left the bank because I know that you're no longer there. Uh, Tell me something about what you observe at moments when you know you need to make a change. Maybe it's a change to another position, uh, not just leaving an institution, but shifting. Tell me a little bit about your process for assessing that.
I think, people often ask me a question about how did you plan your career or what did you do, etc. And I have to say that most of it was happenstance, not really something that I planned.
Mm,
For instance, when um, I was getting tired of working many, many years in Africa and sometimes thinking that my work wasn't going anywhere, I ran into Ann Kruger, who was then had just come to the bank as vice president. And she said to me, she's always admired my work on foreign aid. And I said, "You did?" Because I had no idea that was the case. So she said, "Come to the research department and develop a program on aid and capital flows, etc., which I did then. There are many other things that, like, I was asked to do a review of the bank's forest policy. I
mhm.
knew nothing about it. And in a way, not knowing anything about it makes it more interesting because you have so much to learn from. So, foresters were my gurus on everything. And I wondered, why did they ask me to do this rather than a forester? And I think the general understanding of that was that foresters already had a point of view and they wanted a new point of view. So, again, case studies is an example of how you can bring new perspectives to bear. And I learned a lot by doing a case studies of forestry in China, Brazil, etc., etc. So I think it was just each opportunity as a learning experience and doing the most you can. That's been my approach to life rather than planning my life in a particular way. And I, luckily enough, I enjoy everything I do. Most of the times, I enjoy everything I do. So I don't have to plan anything in advance.
Ah, that's refreshing, actually. So many people have mapped out things, and then they get disappointed if they can't make the moves when they want to. And yet, what you did was simply enjoy what you're doing, and then
Yeah.
you're ready for when there's an opportunity that you can take it, even when you didn't know how to do it. I loved your work in forestry because you're right. You were not only new to forestry, but it was a really hot topic at the time, and,
Yes.
and you had to take it and diffuse it essentially
And
through.
I think, one of the insights I developed in the forestry review of the bank was that countries that had the most forests didn't want the bank involved in it. And the countries that had very little forest left were very keen to have the bank involved.
Mm,
So I asked myself, why is that the case? And that is because the countries that had big forests saw the bank as mostly restricting what they were doing rather than facilitating
mm,
their treatment of forests. Whereas in countries like India, China, who lost all their forests, they were very keen to have the bank involved to have more development of forests, etc. Now, that has implications for how you form a policy. Because if you form a policy based on your imposition of ideas on countries, they are likely to be not very receptive. But if you listen to what they have to say. And we had three countries: Brazil, Indonesia, and Cameroon, which were, we call them, forest rich countries, and other forest poor countries: India, China, and Costa Rica, I think it was. And we learned a lot from what they had to, how they perceive what the bank should be doing to help them. So if you listen to them and then add value beyond what they want you to do, that is where outside agencies can be very useful. So that's how I I learned a lot each time. I developed some new insights, and made me happy.
Mm. Well, I want to also post the final the final lesson that you talked about. Where was it? There it is. That when widely diverse expectations and in the absence of much data, in-depth case study approaches became the hallmark of your research, not only in Africa, but I, I hear from all of your work.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Um, I completely agree, but because I developed increased lot of interest and curiosity about phenomenon,
Mm.
whatever those are, and then to learn from it. And I think if I can reflect on what I have done over the years, it is mainly that I made use of every opportunity I had, whether it was a small opportunity or a big one,
Mhm.
and just had a sense of pouring myself into it.
Mm.
And from that, I've learned a lot. So I consider myself very lucky.
Mm. Well, what you have done feels so enormous that I'm sure that some people will say, well, this doesn't relate to me. And yet, I think in the midst of, and you've just begun saying it right now, what are some things that you would recommend to young people? Say they're in their 20s and 30s, where they're really still, you know, adjusting to career and profession and moving forward. Uh, what are some recommendations and advice you would give to them?
This sounds silly, but it is important. Now I'm in my early 80s. So I have lived professional and personal life for 8 decades. And there is so much that happens when you're young. You don't think about all the things that you can do when as you're growing older, right? So having an open mind and learning and developing your skills and just enjoying what you're doing is tremendously important, because that is what makes you the kind of a person that you are or you end up becoming. And there are, when people used to tell me, you're still young, you have a long way to go. I used to, I used to say, what, 30 years old and you think I'm young? But each year is worth a lot. So developing insights and making use of every opportunity you have, whether it's small or big, to make the most of it. It's quite important.
And the two big things that I heard from you was that you pour yourself into what you're doing and that you enjoy it. You choose to enjoy it.
Yeah. And by the way, it doesn't, uh, I mean, when I look at my life, it doesn't look like a vast amount of work that I have done. I just kept on doing things all the time.
Mhm.
And then little by little, it's like what they say about a bird, one seed at a time, and it adds up. So it doesn't become daunting.
Uma Lele, thank you so much for your time and these wonderful stories from your life. Um,
You're most welcome. I enjoyed talking to you. It's been a while since we have seen each other in
this is
person.
this is true. We
So
will
you have to come
I,
and visit me.
we will correct that.
All right. Nice to chat with you.
Thank you. Bye bye. Think Again: The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know by Adam Grant. This segment of the show is where I share with you some book that has impacted my life and work. It's not meant to be a review or a report or a summary of the book. It's meant to tell you why I found the book to be so powerful for me. Years ago, Professor Mary Gergen once gave me some important advice. When I complained about having to read so many books for my graduate work, she suggested that I trash read some books. Now, trash reading to Mary Gergen was not anything to do with trash. Rather, it was a simple strategy for pulling out the most important lessons from a book. She said to read the title. Okay, that's pretty obvious. Then you should read the dust cover, the table of contents, the introduction, and maybe the preface. By now, she says you have a fair idea of what the book is about. She then said to read the table of contents again and select a chapter that you might want to read and go and read it. As you read the chapter, if your curiosity about the main message of the book has been satisfied, you're done. If your curiosity has been piqued, then keep reading. It was a marvelous lesson for someone like myself who reads very slowly. Great books have a single message, presented with tons of examples and variations and exercises and expansions. The key is to obtain the main message before you decide to invest in reading the entire book. For example, if the main message is one you have little interest in, let's say the title was a bit misleading, it is unlikely that the book will be worthwhile reading. Okay, not worthwhile if you selected the book for yourself, but sometimes, let's face it, you have to read it, maybe for a course. With this approach, I have absorbed the main message of many, many books to my genuine learning. At the same time, the time saved by this approach has allowed me to read many books from page 1 to the very end. There was so much to discover, I had to read every word. In the end, I always know what I have gained from a book, and some have had a profound impact on me. These are the ones I want to share with you here. I attempt in just a few minutes to convey that impact along with a short quotation from the book so that you can both hear about the message and listen to the style of the author. And yes, sometimes I read the book because the style is captivating. Poetry books for me fall into that category. Now, for this week's book of impact, it is Think Again: The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know by Adam Grant. His main premise is that we all need to rethink what we think we know. Keep an open mind that another perspective that might just show us another way to consider the data that we know. I really appreciated very much when Uma talked about her case studies. They were more than a reporting of the facts found, the interviews done, or the observations made. It was also to include the insights of looking at the information in light of different perspectives that may come from earlier experience or from the other members of the team who come from different cultural backgrounds or whatever. It was a stance that says, I know a great deal, but will remain flexible as I search for the truth, like any good scientist, so that other insights can inform my thinking. Here is a paragraph from Grant's book that speaks to this. Quote, when psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi studied eminent scientists like Linus Pauling and Jonas Salk, he concluded that what differentiated them from their peers was their cognitive flexibility, their willingness to move from one extreme to the other as occasion requires, unquote. Flexibility. As I read this to myself, I realized that it was as if these eminent scientists had resilient minds that could encounter the unexpected and see different options from which to choose. Think Again by Adam Grant. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Uma is a very special person, as you can see. This is Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.